Moving on to our member-specific segment. Trey, we're talking about endings.
Mark Slutsky. Mark Slutsky.
What did you call me?
John Smallberries.
John.
Mark Slutsky. Mark Slutsky is a member of our group on Facebook, and he posted about victory points in the Game Brain Facebook group this week. And I think they had a really good discussion. And I think Mark made a pretty good defense of victory points in that thread. And like victory points have been a little under attack, kind of notably last year. We all kind of tuned in on a presentation that Scott Westerfeld did at Shucks last year. And if people are curious about what I'm talking about, you can go on YouTube and just search victory points suck. And that will come up with his presentation. And I'm going to disagree with a lot of it, but I think mostly his criticism was about he wanted, like, he's more of a writer and he wanted his games to have more of a narrative. And I think his thought, if I'm going to summarize it, which is probably unfair, is just that like victory points end up sucking the narrative out of games. I don't necessarily agree, but it did get me thinking about kind of like one of our Game Brain commandments, which is that like when you're teaching a game, one of the first things you want to do is say, how do you win?
Yep.
I also think that like the narrative of the game is important for understanding all of the processes in the game. Like I think that's something that's lacking in some teaching sometimes. It's like if you don't get me with that narrative hook, I'm not going to have that context I need for understanding the mechanisms. Like if you're just telling me, well, you can go here and you can do this and you can go here and do that. If I'm not constructing my mind, like, okay, I'm a real estate developer building a city in the clouds. And before I build my building, I have to like build the ground. I have to construct the ground that it's on, yada, yada. And that's going to take resources. But that narrative context is often important for helping me even understand the game. But if like how you win is one of the first things you say when you're teaching a game, Tom, maybe equally as important might also be how does the game end?
Yeah.
And very often, like this is the same thing, right?
Not always, but sometimes, correct, absolutely.
Right. But there is a difference. Exactly. Yeah. Like sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And I also think that like we should be thinking about game endings in the same way that we've kind of had this talk about mechanisms and theme and how do they tie together. Like the mechanisms should, theme shouldn't just be pasted on. The theme should, or the mechanism should reflect the theme. The wheels, the interlocking gears of Zolkin as an expression of time, such a beautiful expression. But what I would say is like if we apply that same logic, it's like how a game ends says a lot about what the game is trying to be and also the kind of experience that it's trying to create.
Yes, I agree. It's interesting. I do a little prep once I find out what the topic is going to be, and this was one of the more interesting preps that I've done in a long time because I really didn't think about it that way. But you're right. My favorite games do not always correlate with my favorite endings for games. Mm-hmm. They can sometimes be a very different thing. Some of my favorite game endings are ones that are kind of more narrative, but there are great game endings that have no narrative to them whatsoever, but it's merely that the game knows when to draw the curtain, and it draws the curtain in a way that is driven by the game state and by what has come before, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think like Paul, I'm sorry, Ben, why don't you go?
No, I was going to say, I was going to agree with that. I mean, I'm not as staunchly against victory points. I don't see, I think that there is like great excitement in tallying up victory points and, seeing where everything, I forget what the expression is, but where everything falls and lands, and seeing how that all shakes out, I think is very exciting. I think it has the same excitement as tuning in on election day to see where the votes are cast, So I don't have an issue with that. But yeah, I mean, this topic was fascinating because I haven't spent that much time thinking about how a game ends. I've had passing thoughts, but not how what do I like about certain game endings versus other ones. It's been really a cool thing to explore.
Well, we could probably do a whole segment on victory points, and I think victory points are related to game ends, and that's how I settled on game ends. I mean, Paul in his previous segments has talked about like great moments, and I think a lot of times that's going to be inherently tied to endings. Like generally, like the ending of a Battlestar Galactica game is always great, one way or the other. It's very binary. You win, your team wins or loses. That creates a lot of drama. I think that would be what Scott Westerfeld in his presentation is saying he wants more of, and that would be fine.
And by the way, we could put Jaws into the same category, right? Jaws is constructed to have that big ending where you are either on the last part of the orca and you have staved off destruction, or you are the last person alive in the water and you get swallowed by the shark, right?
Well, that's right, because Jaws is, now that we're going to actually, I think, let's spend a little time and get into the actual nitty-gritty here. Like, Jaws actually is a player elimination game.
Yes, it is.
And like, we don't actually do that very much. There's a few games we do in which the last man standing is the winner, but that's not a typical Euro board game thing.
No.
Like, we play Skull. Like, Skull's a good player elimination game.
Sure.
But typically, we like those games need to be kind of shorter, right?
Well, or the old school method of, nope, sorry, you got to sit around for 6 hours and eat some popcorn because we got the game to play. But I will say that while there are so many problems with those old school types of games because of that, those games do gain something for that. They gain great endings. So many of my favorite game endings are from really old school designs.
Well, I think that ultimately one thing that makes for a great ending is a big theatrical moment that will be like, and I think that maybe when you have a player elimination situation, it's going to create a situation. You might wind up with a theatrical ending, right? When it comes down to a battle between these two parties, these two people, these two teams, and then finally someone wins, you're going to have that moment of, but you might also have that moment when there's a big reveal, and that reveal could be like, it was me all along, or it's in decrypto, and like, these were my words all along, or like, and here are my hidden points that you didn't realize. So I think that to me is the most valuable factor in creating a really fun end state.
Yeah, I mean, it could also be, Everdell, even though you didn't love it. Everdell is interesting because it's one of those games that ramps, and it ramps in a very interesting way. At the beginning of the game, there are 4 seasons in the game. The entire first season passes, and you've done almost nothing. And you're like looking at the rules, seeing, you can have a maximum of 12 or 15 cards in your city, and you're like, how am I going to have more than 4 cards in my city? And then by the end of the game, you're taking these massive turns where everything you've done is building up to each other, and it does have a feeling of swelling. Now, it may be more individual swelling because you're taking your big massive turn, and then the next person takes their big massive turn to some degree, but there is a build that is built into that feels very satisfying in terms of an ending.
Right. Well, it's like 3-act structure. I think we talked about this on a previous episode that maybe it was the episode when we talked about what brings us back. Games are like stories, and this is where the speaker in that video, I think I agree with him that there is, I think the best games do have a, they are a 3-act structure. They build, they reach a climax, etc. I feel like he was being very literal about it, though, like that there has to be a boss battle of some sort, even if it's abstracted, that there has to be a boss battle. And if you have that, you're going to have real stakes, etc. I think for me, the 3-act structure means that we have to have a ramping up of personal stakes in this game, and a sense of that, like where we are in the last third of the game or the last section of the game feels very different than where we were in the first third, and that if you have that structure, I think that probably you will have an ending that will feel satisfying usually.
All right, let's real quick go over let's actually look at some mechanisms of how games end. We'll do this quickly though, Tom.
I don't mind. I got a lot to say about this.
Okay, great. First off, let's consult the Bible. Building Blocks of Tabletop Design, an Encyclopedia of Mechanisms. I don't know if this is a people's radar yet, but this is a book put out, I think, just last year by Jeff Fingelstein and Isaac Shilev. And it's really great. If you're serious about wanting to kind of get into board game design, I think this is an important thing to have.
Please turn in your Bibles to the Book of Endings, Chapter 7, verses 17 through 24.
This would be chapter 5 in the Bible. Because like Endgame, what's interesting though is that like Endgame and Victory are related. Like same way that victory, like we're talking about, like victory points can be both how we determine who wins and how the game ends. And so like the most common way that games, well, I don't know if it's the most common way, but like the simplest one is a game can end with when a certain score is reached. So like the example, like for racing games, this is 1-for-1. When you get to the end, the person who wins, is the person who crosses the finish line first. And like your position on the track could just is your score, right? Like if you're playing Snakes and Ladders is the example they use in the book, the game ends when somebody gets to 100. Your position on the board is your score. Okay.
Yes.
So some work that way. For example, Catan.
Yes.
When you get to 10, you win.
Yes.
The end. 10 or more you did. Then there's other games where they kind of separate this out a little bit, where the game is going to end when a certain threshold is hit, but that doesn't mean that the person who triggered the end game necessarily won.
Right.
Right? Like Tichu is a little bit this way. In that, like, you can be in the middle of a hand of Tichu and be like, this game is going to end this turn. Yeah. But it doesn't mean you necessarily won.
No, Tribune and Race for the Galaxy are both those ways. Race for the Galaxy, when the pile, one of the ways the game can end is when the pile of victory point chits is expended, that triggers the end of the game, but it does not in any way determine who has won yet. And in Tribune, there are a number of conditions, and when someone has fulfilled 4 of them, they announce that, and that then becomes the last round of the game. But it in no way says that person has won.
That's right. Like Tuscany is a good example of this. Like the game's going to end when we get to 25 points. Like this is going to be, everybody's like, okay, this is the last round. Even Fort, again, I know you guys haven't played Fort. Like Fort has multiple conditions that can end the game, but like you're going to finish the round. Yeah. A lot of these games are like end game has been hit. Now we have to finish the round out of fairness. Sometimes we have these games where like you don't finish the round and that feels unfair and people argue about it.
Is multiple ending conditions an ending condition in and of itself in the Bible in terms of the way it's separated? Because I do find that some of the most interesting game endings are ones in which there are several metrics that can trigger an ending, and thereby the game being played to drive toward one of those endings for your own personal advantage is very exciting often.
Yes, and like you're skipping ahead to like number 6. But like there's games like Fort or Concordia that can have multiple end game things that will trigger the end game, and then there's an even subcategory of that the book would describe as sudden death. For example, when you play Twilight Struggle, Tom, there are ways to win the game instantly.
Yeah, there are 4 different metrics by which you can win in Twilight Struggle. You can win by triggering nuclear war. You can win by conquering Europe. You can win by playing a card in the late part of the game that will give you the win if you've met certain conditions. Or there is the most common victory condition, which is the points tug of war. If you get the slider to your end of the far end of the scale, you win. So they're very different ones. I would say Glory to Rome also is like that. In the play of certain buildings will change the end condition of the game to some degree, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Right. Most, again, keep saying most, but a lot of the games we play are based on rounds. The games are gonna play after a set number of rounds.
Boring.
Boring?
Well, it's the least sexy ending condition, and yet it makes for sometimes the best games because. If I know how long I have, then I can make more interesting decisions in planning. So you always have to take into account the end of a game, in the context of how the game plays. And a lot of these games are based on advanced planning, right? Mm-hmm. That's what strategy is.
I mean, with rounds, it sort of takes away a certain amount of player agency, right? Because there is a fate to this game, and it's you're going to have a certain amount of rounds to do a certain number of things, and then once that happens, once you're done with doing those things, it is over. And it reminds me of what my dad says about baseball. Baseball is his favorite sport because there's no ticking clock. It's the only major team sport that doesn't have that, right? Everyone else has quarters or something, or the equivalent of,
George Carlin,
and when
does a
that
great
clock
thing on
runs
that,
out, the game is over. There is the upside to that, which is that when that clock is running out in a football game, those can be just some of the most exciting, tense moments that you will ever remember. For some people in their lives. I will always remember when Eli Manning threw that pass to David Tyree and the Giants beat the Patriots in the last seconds of the Super Bowl.
Tom, can we edit this part out of
No, that's exactly
is this
what.
Bringing out any vicious?
It is perfect. You
memories?
could not have said that better. It is literally one of the. It's the great moment in sports, really.
It's
great
probably
moment.
the best moment of all of our lives.
Yeah, exactly. But I will say the miracle Mets though of '87, that World Series.
Stay on target.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, but rounds are, I think, to bend to your point, though, is like rounds in board games are generally like the main expression of time. Like
Yes.
we generally don't play games with ticking clocks. And we're like excited that a game's coming out now that's going to have some stand timers or whatever. But like, we're not going to play a game that lasts 1 hour. Like we play a game with rounds, and that's the expression of time. And like, that's pretty standard. Like Agricola is going to play 14 rounds. We just played Dilluvia Project. That's going to play what, 7 or 8?
Mm-hmm.
7.
Yep, 7.
7 exactly. Every time, and then we start to play games that kind of that start to break these rules or spin off of that. For example, I was playing Anachrony with Matt last week. Like that has a minimum number of rounds where like the end of the world has been triggered, but that doesn't mean the game is actually going to end on this round. Like it can actually continue for a number of 3 rounds, up to like 3 additional rounds based upon player decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. I'm not sure I loved that in Anachrony, but like that was interesting. It's like this game can keep going. And then like Tom, I was thinking of a weird kind of hybrid between like score and rounds is something like Civilization.
Yes.
Like Civilization has a minimum number of rounds because the real way you are like, there's 2 different ways you're keeping score. Like you have a certain number of like what civilization points or whatever, but mainly you're like on the AST, you're on the archaeological succession track, and you're like advancing on that track. And so like the game's going to go a minimum number of rounds for you to win. But like you can win that game without the highest score by just being further along on the track.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I was just talking with Jennifer about this a couple of weeks ago. She was complaining about how we've lost the ability to play games certain ways. Like we lost the ability to play games meanly, where in some games you need to. And Civilization is one of those things. Some people have a very advantageous archaeological succession track in which if they just keep plugging along, they will never stop on it, and they will move ahead and move ahead and move ahead, whereas other countries, other nations will have very difficult ASTs where they were almost guaranteed to be stuck, and then they're around behind everybody else on that. And so their game must, by definition, to some extent, be to attack the people that are doing well on the archaeological succession track to slow down their civilization, which is a very interesting aspect to that game.
Yeah,
they'll have other advantages, and that's like a balancing tool. But like that's ultimately like, and I think that was like a challenge that a lot of people had when they were first learning Civilization, is like they could get confused because they would look at the board and say, "Look at my board, I'm winning clearly," and you're like, "No, the game's over here. The game's on the AST, my friend.
Yeah,
and you're behind. You're 1 behind on the AST, and that's why you have to go and attack Crete." That type of thing. Okay, so that was rounds. We touched on player elimination before, just to point out that like player elimination, although we think of this as kind of mean, it's actually like a mainstay of a lot of the most popular consumer board games in American history. I mean, Monopoly is a player elimination game.
Yes,
Risk is a player elimination game.
Yep.
We also have exhausting resources. A lot of times games are triggered when something has been exhausted. like we were talking about Race for the Galaxy. That's one example.
Food chain magnate.
Fast food magnate, absolutely. And again, like most money is like money, victory points. It's the same thing, but like that's going to be triggered when the bank runs out.
Every 18xx, exactly.
Yeah.
Through the age, every 18xx is that way. I didn't know that.
But by the way, 18xx, I'm sorry to interrupt, but 18xx is sort of interesting because it's, again, I'm a newbie to the hobby, but it's either the bank runs out or someone goes bankrupt, which is sort of like a little bit of player elimination too.
Yeah.
And it kind of creates this interesting situation where you're probably, I imagine you get to a certain point where you are trying to get someone to be bankrupt when you're at the right amount of time, like at the right, where you're leading everyone. So that way you can like nail down that win. And then then that sort of window may pass if everyone has a permanent train, at which point then you're just trying to now like pivot to gobble up all the money, right? Which I think is really it's sort of unique to me that the game could really have sort of like one path to ending the game, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, and now we are changing, and it's like a twist in the middle of the movie, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The final example of this, which I think is really great, is Through the Ages. Through the Ages does not have a set number of rounds. That game's going to end when you've exhausted the cards in the game. And like the more I played that game, I realized that there was more to the game in terms of like manipulating the game length that could happen in how people purchase cards. And again, this goes to Paul. Like Paul, a lot of times will kind of get out to a lead in that game, and then he needs to rush the ending. Like he needs to buy up bunches of cards because he knows if this game goes one round longer, I'm going to, like my military is going to crush him in a war. So like he needs to bring the game to a close. I think he enjoys exploring the space.
But he always explores the space the same way. We're talking about the same thing again and again. He's always rushing at the beginning.
Think so. No, I give him a lot more credit than that. And he's very good. He's very good at that game.
He is.
He's very good at that game.
I'm just messing with him.
Like, I know you're messing with him, but like we do almost in the same way, going back to like the DILLUVIA project, where like I felt like there was a standard way to play. You showed a different way to play. I mean, thank God we have Paul to pivot and press the other buttons to open up, because like we can get stuck in our own meta.
Yeah.
We're not talking about Avalon here.
No,
but
Paul will take the road less traveled by. Yeah, he will.
Yeah, we absolutely can. Okay, another ways game can end. Completing targets. Dune. Like you can kind of say, getting to 2 points in Dune wins you the game or whatever, but like capturing cities is 3 if you're an individual. Yeah, and 4 if you're in an alliance, blah, blah, blah. But you complete a certain number of targets. Race for the Galaxy, like you get to 12 cards is kind of the same thing. And then maybe a final one. We covered sudden death. And then like the final one that's kind of note is like a fixed number of events. Or it's going to trigger the game. And like in high society, the game ends when we have, Tom, help me out here.
It's
like
the third red card comes out. When the third red card is flipped up, the game ends immediately without that card being auctioned.
And don't the PAX games have like we're flipping cards, and when we've played like 3 wars or something like that, or 3 scores or something.
It's not that. It's there are event cards that can be triggered. And when they trigger, there is the possibility for the game to end if certain conditions are met. And in other cases, it is you simply gain score, but you do not have enough score to trigger the end of the game at that point. But yeah, that's exactly right.
Or like Las Vegas, Lords of Vegas. Has one. By the way, there's also a huge asterisk on all this, is that we're not talking about cooperative games here, because that's a whole different ball game.
Well, I mean,
so we'll talk on that, like, because what do you mean?
Well, meaning that, like, I mean, I guess they all have like triggers or whatever, but I feel like end game triggers in a cooperative game have a totally different. I just feel like it's a totally different.
It's been a while since I've played Pandemic. How does Pandemic end?
Pandemic can end in a few ways, right? Like if you it's sort of like a bunch of these things. Right? If you run out of like Pandemic cubes to put on the board, then you lose. If you have
exhausted resources, then though.
So like exhausted resources.
If the Pandemic slider gets down to a certain level, it ends the game.
Right, or if you run out of cards.
Target.
Yep.
But it's like but it's almost like I feel like with a lot of cooperative games there is like a overlap of various different. It's sort of like uses a lot of these things that we're talking about and puts and meshes them together in these hybrids, which can be really fascinating.
Trey, is there anything else in the Bible? I'm sorry.
Well, no, I think we were making a distinction also. Like a lot of these games have single end conditions and others have multiple. Maybe what Ben's talking about is that these cooperative games tend to have a lot or more likely to have multiple end game conditions. There's multiple ways that Battlestar Galactica can end with humans being destroyed, right? And that works narratively really, really well.
Well, it's because in a cooperative game, in most cooperative games anyway, the game is an engine of its own, right? It's not it's not players in their engines. It's the game is playing its own game, and we are reacting to it to a large extent.
Yeah.
So
is a way to think of these like these are fail states.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So my question is top 3 game ends. What are your top 3? Or Trey, I don't want to hijack anything. If you,
No.
I've
said what I wanted to say. So if you've got your list of great game endings, go for it.
I got so many. I have so many, but I definitely have some that are better than most. Okay, so things that are interesting in terms of game ending, I think D-Mocker, my favorite game of all time, is interesting in the sense that you go through this game where you are doing one election per round, and you are spending resources not just on the current election, but on the future elections. And then in the last round, it is a super short 7th election where you don't get to do any of the normal stuff. You just basically do election 6, and then election 7 happens immediately afterwards without any additional materials, which I think is a very smart decision, because what they're essentially doing is they're racing you toward the end game. The Great Zimbabwe is very interesting because when you choose different gods, you get different advantages, but it also changes your end state. Your end state becomes suddenly you have to reach 30 points, or you only have to, and another person with a weak god has weak advantages, but they only have to score 15 points to end the game. And that's a very interesting thing that Splatter does a lot. They do that in Antiquity as well. There are different cathedrals that you build, and they give you superpowers. They give you advantages. And there's one that gives you every advantage in the game, but now you have to fulfill 2 whole victory conditions instead of 1 in order to win the game, which I thought was really interesting. I think that Reiner Knizia is great at game endings. I think that's one of his best things. High Society, which we mentioned, has an amazing game ending in which you are bidding and bidding and bidding. You don't know when the game is going to end. And when it ends, you immediately count up your points. Most points wins, but least money on hand loses immediately. And we know how many points you have. What we don't know is how much money everybody has left. And that is fascinating. How many times?
And that's a game that you don't know when it's going to end, too, by the way.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
How many times have you played High Society where the person you're pretty sure is won flips over their money and you realize they have $2 million less than everybody else at the table? And it's amazing. I also say Samurai is another great one, where you're battling and battling for all of these rewards on the islands of Japan, but the rewards that you get go behind your screen, and it's only at the end of the game that everybody lifts up their screen and reveals how many of the hi-hats you have, how many of the Buddhas you have, how many of those 3 different symbols, and it's a reveal ending. It's kind of a surprise ending where I think I'm doing great, but have I done enough? And it's always right on the razor's edge, that game, which is kind of amazing. But
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that like if you have more examples, I don't want to.
I have plenty, but I've been talking for a long time already. So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I think that like there's rarely a game where I'll say, oh, I don't like this game because I don't like how the ending is. I don't like how we reveal our points or how this happens. You know, that will rarely happen. That being said, I do prefer a game that is more of a race game, or we're racing for an end game trigger a little bit more than one that has a fixed amount of rounds, just because I like the feeling that we could we can control the situation, that maybe we might there. It opens up an opportunity for meta. I can't tell you how many times I've been playing Concordia, and I know I'm a few turns away, and there's like 2 cards sitting in the display left, and the moment that someone takes those 2 cards, the game is going to be over. And all of a sudden, you have to shift into this really fascinating, like new game where you're kind of trying to like maybe put doubt in someone's head that makes them maybe not want to end the game, or maybe you are trying to distract someone away from those 2 cards or something, and like all of a sudden there's a meta going on, like you're trying to get people to not finish the game, or it could be the flip side where I'm ready to finish that game, I'm ready to finish this game, but I need to play my Tribune to get my cards back so that way I can play the Senator so I can get those cards. And I also have to get those resources. I have to do this all before someone catches up to me, which is like a really exciting thing, which is why I think Concordia has that really exciting third act that I was talking about. I love that. I feel like in games with rounds, you still have an amazing time, and it can still feel like a climax. But at the end of the time, I just feel like it's more empowering to feel like you're controlling the fate of the game, as opposed to, I'm not getting to do all the things I want to do, which is its own fun for sure, but it's a different fun. I will say, by the way, about DILLUVIA project, what's kind of cool is that in the final round, the market clears off, and we have a set market structure that's always the same, which is cool because I think that's really fair to the players. But it also kind of imbues that last round with this sense of like, we have arrived at the final round, ladies and gentlemen. And it sort of does create like a little bit of a pageantry around it that makes it feel like we are here. Now it's time to make our big final last ditch efforts.
Well, and the city's complete also at that point. Like visually, It looks like a city now, and there's very little real estate left.
Yes, exactly.
Yep.
So I think at the end of the day, for me, I just like a game that ends with an emotional climax, whether it's from victory points or not. When I watched that video, the guy was saying about he made this proclamation that if you have to hide your victory points, it's like you're basically having to hide. Isn't it bad storytelling if you have to hide away like key points to make it more interesting? And I'm like, well, have you ever heard of a murder mystery? I mean, I think that like there's something about a reveal that is very exciting, and it's very like it's a classic part of storytelling. I think that's okay. I think with Catan, one thing that I love about Catan is, like, let's say I've got my I'm at 9 points, and at 10 points I'm going to win, but I'm also maybe sitting on longest road, and there's someone over there who only has 6 settlements, but they have 3 development cards face down in front of them, and I don't know what those development cards are. Mm-hmm. They could be 3 points, or they could be 3 other things, but they're playing with my mind at this point, and what's happening, what's going to happen, and I'm about to make this move and finish the game, and I'm going to win, and then that person, those were 3 points, or whatever it was, they turn over that last card, and it's like, oh my god, I can't believe you with your 6 things managed to get this victory, and it's like, that's an exciting moment. And I think those moments in a game, in a finale, where you do have a reveal of some hidden information can be like great. That's like what gaming's all about sometimes.
Ben, I have no idea what you were just talking about, but it sounds like it might be a good game to try at some point. And listen, and game endings can even have just great moments that are totally separate from who won and who lost. Age of Steam has the break-even applause break, right? Where you finally broken even, you are no longer in debt, you're no longer bleeding to death, and everybody gives you the nice round of applause. Yay! You are no longer in debt and dying. Which is always great. A lot of games are like that. But for me, I think some of my favorite endings are, first of all, there are narrative endings, right? There are truly narrative endings. Soul Last Days of a Star is you're trying to gather up enough energy to escape our solar system and travel to the stars. And at the end of the game, you've literally, one person's won and another person's done this and everything, but the book's gives you your outcome based on how many points, what point range you were actually in, which is kind of cool. Detective is interesting because I think deduction endings invariably are interesting, right? But detective scores your success. It tells you how well you did in terms of solving your case. You know, how much more work has yet to be done. If the charges that you are arranging are going to stick or not. I think that's really, really interesting. But some of my, I think my three favorite endings are all old school games. They're really that way. Warlord, the very first podcast, I mentioned my old favorite game, Warlord, which is just sort of nuclear Risk of a sort. At the end of that game, to see the huge map just filled with nuclear devastation, and one person, player elimination has just swept what remains of the board, is just such an old school pleasure. It's amazing. Kremlin would be my number 2, which is you're trying to get your puppet to to the head of the line, to wave at the parade, to survive, to not croak and die. And sometimes in that game, you will sit there with all of this influence on this one guy, and you won't spend it. You're going to let somebody else rise that person all the way to the top, and then right before they're about to wave at the parade, you announce your influence total, you take control of that person, and you steal the game away from them. There are a few moments that have happened at a game table where everybody isn't just screaming and pulling their hair out at what just happened, which is amazing. But the number one ending of all time for me is when you get a Bene Gesserit ending for Dune. So
I don't know.
It is the best. It's the best thing. It's the best thing in gaming. It is the best moment in gaming when you are battling in Dune the whole game, and you're fighting with each other, and finally these two different groups get together. They conquer 4 different strongholds. They win the game, and they're like, "Oh, I can't believe we did it! We did it!" They're high-fiving each other, and then the person playing Bene Gesserit said, "Excuse me, just one moment." At the very beginning of the game, the Bene Gesserit player writes down the name of one faction and writes down the round in which they will win. And if that happens, if that faction wins in that round of the game, they reveal their prediction, and then that team does not win. Only the Bene Gesserit win. And
that's fun.
Because the Bene Gesserit are one of the weakest powers, and yet their power can aid or harm people. And so
it's the shooting the moon.
Yes,
essentially.
Yeah. It is. It's shooting the moon.
Well, also, I think.
Sorry,
Trey. You go.
No, I mean, looking at our own group here, I think there's a reason why we've played hundreds and hundreds of games of Avalon. Is that Avalon almost inevitably has a great ending.
Oh yeah.
Like that always works. And, maybe just to kind of like, for me, and then we'll get back to you, Ben, like going back to my original point of like the ending should be appropriate to the game. Like these endings, it really is about emotion.
Yeah.
A lot of times. And when we were kind of talking about like games that can have a variable ending where it's not a set number of rounds. Like when you play Zulk, I'm going to talk about some games that are kind of comparable here. When you play Zulkin, there's a set number of rounds, but you can kind of like you can advance the game earlier. Like remember, you can kind of, when you go first, you can choose to advance the wheel a little bit quicker. But generally, like you can see the end of the game and you can plan. Like I got 4 rounds left to do this. What am I going to do? And a lot of games don't want to do that because it can create AP where you have this like calculation, both in terms of like, what do I have to do? But also who's winning? What's their exact score? I have to play optimally, and like and the whole thing grinds down. It still works in Zulkin, but like 2 games recently in which the game can kind of like end early are Teotihuacan and Maracaibo. And in Teotihuacan, like the eclipse can be triggered earlier by people ascending their workers quicker. And a lot of times I'm playing that game and I'm like, okay, my game is going to be great as long as I can have 3 more actions.
Right.
And inevitably I don't get those 3 actions.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, like that doesn't bother me. Like I can see the board. I was like, of course Paul's going to ascend. Of course. And like that just feels like, okay, that was part of the game, and that was like satisfying, and I feel like, okay, well done. And emotionally, like even when I like lose in that, like the way the game comes to an end feels organic, feels right for what they're doing. Whereas for me, like I bounced off Maracaibo pretty hard, and I know other people haven't. But like when I've played Maracaibo and you see people like rushing that game to an end, like it just annoys me. It's like, why? I just want to play the damn game, and you're just bringing it. You're bringing it to a close, and like I'm not able to do any of the things I want to do in this game because you just keep on taking quick turns. I don't want to play this. I'm sure there's a lot of really great game there, but like emotionally, I'm in a bad place a lot of times when that game ends, and so I don't want to play it.
Yeah. I think that also, like, you want a game that, like, the ending not only elicits like a really exciting theatrical, moment, but it feels appropriate for what you're playing too. You want to feel like this is an exciting coda on the gaming experience. And another game that we played recently was The Cost. And one issue that we discussed in it was when we had our playthrough, when Paul destroyed the Earth, and he got to win. There was no negative repercussion.
He was rewarded for doing it.
And so I actually, just a few days ago, even before this topic, there was a thread going on Board Game Geek about the game, about negative repercussions for mining unsafely. And so I asked the designers, I said, recently we played a game where the guy who destroyed the world, he didn't receive there was nothing negative. It wasn't like there was no incentive for him to stop destroying the world, because the moment that he closed down all those markets, then the game would be over and he would win.
Yeah.
And the designer said, yeah, because in real life, if you were to do that, it's not like their profits go away. They still have their money and they can go buy their yachts and yada, yada, yada. I mean, I might have countered that actually, well, they no longer have their markets to sell their stuff to, but they were kind of the mindset
the
of
world ended. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's not like the world ended. It's just the markets closed down. And so they were of the mindset of like, well, yep, this is what happens. And they basically we put in that game system to serve a narrative function.
Yeah, inequalityopoly, right? It's the same as inequalityopoly. They're making a point, and it may come at the detriment of gameplay, but sometimes you make that decision.
Yeah, and so it's funny because it's almost as if the speaker in the video was saying that the problem with the victory points is that it takes away from the narrative arc. And here we had a situation where actually the narrative arc was preserved, but was it really the best ending in terms of fun and gameplay? Maybe not,
Yeah, and once again, must every game be fun? Is that one of the requirements? For some people, yes. For some people, maybe not. Maybe the medium can withstand some other goals and some other design imperatives. Which is interesting. Gentlemen, we are not going to have time for a game sommelier today. We are running a little bit long, but I for the best reason possible. I think this is a fascinating topic.
Do we have an end game trigger? Is that what you're saying?
We do.
We've triggered our ending. Yes.
We've just hit it. It was a fascinating subject. I could talk about this for another hour, no problem whatsoever. It was a really great topic. Thank you, Trey.
Great.
And guys, I had such a fun. I'm glad, Trey, that you were happy for me to win for the first time ever, because I had a great time playing.
Let us mark this date in history.
Let us write it down into the book. Into the book, it shall go.
There shall not be a second.
I was happy for you too, Tom.
Oh, thank you, Ben. But you're often happy for me.
Outwardly facing. You're a
positive person.
Outwardly facing.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, you very well might enjoy the other videos you now see being suggested to you on screen. Also, we'd greatly appreciate it if you could like, share, or subscribe to our Game Brain channel. Thanks so much.